morning, friends. We're going to go ahead and get started with the Adult Forum. Apologies, we were sort of cobbling together a couple of PowerPoints this morning. It took a minute to get it all working on the computer, but we are back to talk again about where we are with the Capital Campaign. At the last vestry meeting in October, based on the results of the Feasibility Study, the vestry voted to go ahead with the Capital Campaign in early 2019. We wanted to say, get a chance to come together and talk about how we got here. We want to take a look at what we heard in the Feasibility Study together. The Feasibility Study's executive summary has been available on our website and in the weekly email for the past several weeks. And so we wanted to take a chance to look at that together and what we heard. And then based on our initial conversations with the architect and with the fundraisers, we want to talk about what the priorities that the vestry has started identifying are going to look like. And then finally, the vestry has also been having conversations about the financing of the Capital Campaign and the renovation. And we just want to be really clear about how that's going, especially since just a couple of weeks after the vestry voted to go ahead with the Capital Campaign and make the boiler and air conditioner the #1 priority, the boiler went out on us. So we want to be really clear about how we're going forward with that financially. And so I asked your wardens and your treasurer to join me in this presentation as we take a look at where we are with the Capital Campaign and the Feasibility Study. So I want to start out by asking Shirley Mensa to come up.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I think it was just about 2 months ago that I was in front of all of you talking about the feasibility study, which was at the time upcoming, and urging everyone to fill out a survey that would then be analyzed by the consultant that we contracted with, Aaron Weber Johnson. And we did that. So before we talk about the results, I thought that it would be important for us to talk about how we got here. Is this mine?
You're on. Yeah, it's on.
Okay, so how did we get here? How did we get to the point of the feasibility study? I'm sure that most of you will remember that 2 years ago, probably over 2 years ago, we went through this strategic thinking process, the mission and vision process. I'm sure that most of you will remember. And in doing that, we identified our core parish values: welcome, diversity, community. And we came up with a mission statement and strategic filter for analyzing what goals we would pursue as a parish. We came up with short-term goals. And as a follow-up to that goal-setting process, over a year ago, we began a discernment phase for a capital campaign. And really the primary purpose of that discernment phase was to help us answer the question, what is it that God is calling us to do as a parish? And focusing on the mission statement, the mission that we've adopted, we've said that as a welcoming, diverse community, we are seeking to walk in the way of Jesus. We've said that we're seeking to reveal Christ's reconciling love in our community, in our nation, and in our world. And so this process was to help to answer the question, how are we going to live into that mission that we've adopted as a parish? And just as importantly, whatever it is that we identify as the way we're going to live out our mission, what resources are we going to need in order to accomplish that? So that was the purpose of that. If you remember, we had listening sessions, we had small group discussions. And we asked the question, what's working well in our parish? Where are we limited? what are the areas that we need to improve on, whether it's programmatically or with respect to our building. We asked everyone, if money was no object, what would we want to see as a parish? What would we want both in terms of our programs and in terms of the building itself? And so based on the responses that we got during that discernment process, the vestry decided that it was appropriate at that point to contract with Vandersall to do the feasibility study. So that was the point that brings us back to a couple of months ago when we asked you all to fill out the survey. And you know what? This congregation did that. If you read the executive summary, you saw that we had an over 31% response rate, which in a vacuum may not seem like much, but statistically, it's a really high response rate. At our last vestry meeting, Aaron Weber Johnson, he wanted to put a different last name on that. Aaron walked us through the results of the feasibility study. I found it really helpful. I think most vestry members did. And she explained why that was a significant response rate. It helps to validate the recommendations that are in the feasibility study. It helps us to feel confident that most of the people who would be contributors to a capital campaign did in fact weigh in on what they saw as priorities for our parish. So I want to thank every single person who took the time, on behalf of the vestry, I want to thank every single person who took the time to fill out the survey, whether we did it online or in paper, or sat for an interview with Aaron, because your responses are extremely important to the results. I think that's all I have before turning it over to Mike, who will now talk about the results.
So, as Shirley started to talk about, there were several learnings from the feasibility study itself. First, that high participation rate, the numbers for a feasibility study, Erin, who's our consultant, does this all over the church. She's been doing this for more than a decade. And she said these were some of the highest numbers she has seen in terms of participation rate in the survey and eagerness to get forward with the campaign. The favorability was really high, the participation was really high. She said it speaks to a congregation that gets along with each other, that knows what's going on, that's tuned in, and to a vestry that's done a really good job of communicating what's coming. So that was really good to hear. She said that the willingness to contribute at this stage was off the chart, which I kind of read two ways. One, she's really enthusiastic. Erin is very enthusiastic about what this means for the potential of the coming capital campaign. I also read it as, we've been talking about this long enough that some folks are just ready to fill out a card and be done. And I hear you, and I promise there's not going to be that much more sort of discussing. But given where we were as a congregation when we started this, it felt important to put some more energy and some more effort into the discernment around this campaign. We spent more time and more money on an architect in the initial phases than often you would do. We hired an architect before we concluded that we were going to do a campaign to take a look at the whole building. And we brought in engineers and we learned a lot about what are the must-dos and it took some time to really get into the fabric of the building. It also took some time to listen to the congregation, and the feasibility study was one piece of that. But I think it says that we're in this together. The favorability of the campaign is high. The other thing that you'll see, and I'll make note two things about it. We asked an architect for a 20-year master plan, and the architect came back with $1.8 million in potential renovations and updates. When we tested the campaign, we heard back from the congregation that we can raise probably about $800,000, $823,000. And that could feel like, oh no, we can't make the goals of the campaign. But remember, that was a 20-year plan that the architect gave us. So one of the things that Aaron has said is by setting a goal, and then the vestry has voted on a goal for the capital campaign of $823,000, we are able to do some very strategic, very focused renovations. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. The other thing, and I said this from the pulpit a couple weeks ago, one of the things that I didn't know was in the water around here, I'm still a new enough rector around here that I'm learning, but the last two capital campaigns happened to have happened when you all were going through a rector transition. And so that we started Capital Campaign meant that people in the congregation were starting to wonder if I was leaving. Well, as I said from the pulpit, we're not planning to go anywhere. In fact, the canons of the Episcopal Church make it almost impossible to fire a rector except for some very specific reasons. So you're stuck with me. But know and hear that I really want to be a part of the building that we renovate. I want to worship in the new space. I want to get to be here for a while after we get this done, after all the construction's done and the pledges have been paid. So I'm not going anywhere. But that was an anxiety that was in the system, and we needed to talk about it. So to talk a little bit more about what we heard. So Stouter Architects, as I said, gave us a 20-year master plan with $1.8 million potential renovations. The feasibility study returned a suggested primary goal of $823,000, which the vestry adopted. So there's a lot we can do for this amount of money. And it's more than just the must-fix items. There are some items that we have to do. As soon as we start opening something up, we have to do it. It's things like we knew that as soon as we did something with a boiler, we were going to have to add something called a black backflow mechanism that was not built into our previous boiler. As soon as we start doing stuff with electricity, we're going to have to upgrade panels. There are certain things that we must do. But $823,000 gets us quite a bit farther than just must fix. There are some projects that need to go on the back burner. Susan will say more about some of those that were part of the renovation plans that we shared with you from the architect. Some of those will just need to go on the back burner. Some of the projects will need to be scaled down. I'll say a word about one of those. And then some projects will receive full funding at $823,000. So I want to say something about the prioritization process, if the machine will let me. There. So the vestry is in a place now of having to take all that we got from the architect, and all that we got from the congregation, and all that we got from the feasibility study, and try to make decisions about what we're going to do going forward with the renovation. And that's a tricky dance, right? Because we're also still talking to folks and still asking you all to give to the campaign. And we know that if certain fixtures are not popular, it may make the campaign more difficult. There's a lot going into this. So I just want to be really transparent about how we're making these decisions. So a high priority in this process is congregational feedback. What do we hear from the congregation? Both in our conversations throughout the spring and early summer, and in the feasibility study itself, what did people tell us? But we've got to weigh that with some other questions, things like necessary work. Electricity may not pull well. We may not want to spend a bunch of money upgrading, putting new panels in, but we have to. We're a building owner and we have to do some things. There's also a question of what is smart to do. Once you start doing certain renovations, it doesn't make sense not to proceed forward with something else that you know you're going to need to do. I've told this story before, but when I lived in downtown St. Louis, when I was on the road for the presiding bishop, I was out of town, but when I was in town, I was officing, and I had a big bank of windows that looked out over Lucas Park and the Central Library downtown. And it meant that I looked over this little alleyway, Lucas Street. And over the course of the year that I lived there, I watched the power company tear up the street to lay new power lines, the telephone company pull up the street to lay new internet, and then the sewer company pull up the street to lay new sewer line. All in a year. And I thought, maybe they could have talked to each other and only done the street once. I don't want to get in that position. If we open up a the wall to do something with electricity. We're also going to do things with speakers. We're also going to do things with HVAC. If we reconfigure the space that the organ is, we're also going to update the space next to it because we have to move walls around, and it doesn't make any sense to leave one space because you might save $5 now. When you want to go and renovate it later, you got to spend $20 to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So some of this is just about smart decisions. And sometimes cost and flexibility have to outweigh emotional response. I'm going to tell you, one of the things that I know that we're nervous about is the seating question. I know that there are people that are nervous about what does it mean if we are not in the current configuration of pews. I think the vestry has done a really good job talking about that. I think the architect is really listening to us. The next slide you're going to see is a really rough rendering that is going to go to an artist for all the cover material for the Capital Campaign. You will see that we are talking about a mix of pews and chairs. Part of that is because we want to make sure that the space is flexible. The question about flexibility in the feasibility study got a high response. And there were people that were nervous about doing something to the pews. Well, we had people that responded, yes, flexibility, and don't change the pews. But to get flexibility, you have to do something with the pews. The other thing that we're facing is fixing the pews in their current configuration would be more expensive than fixing some of the pews and doing chairs. That fixing word is interesting as well. It gets us into the question about God's mission. Part of flexibility is about being able to utilize spaces for the work that God is calling us to do. I have a Baptist colleague, missionary Baptist pastor named Daryl Johnson. We've been working together on some justice organizing work here in St. Louis recently. He is the pastor at a congregation on Florissant, and he said when he got there, they had these beautiful pews, but they had never put them into the ground. They never put the bolts in and put them into the ground. And he said he would watch people sort of push them around and they'd get slightly out of line and it was driving him nuts. And he said, a couple of Saturdays, I almost just showed up with my drill and bolted them in myself. And I said, I've been there, brother. Not with pews, but with other things. But 2 winters ago, this congregation got asked to be part of winter outreach. They were looking for another congregation to open a shelter on Florissant. The only space that congregation had that was large enough to house the number of people that winter outreach wanted to house was the sanctuary. And he said, I was really grateful those pews weren't bolted to the ground because we just pushed them out of the way and we set up cots. And I said, that gives me another reason to talk to this congregation about why we need flexibility. We're talking about eventually reconfiguring multiple spaces around here. I would rather be in a space that is flexible. We've got a necessary repair to do with the flooring in the church. In my mind, it makes sense to fix some of our historic pews, make them look really nice, keep them available, but not to bolt them to the ground in case we want to use the sanctuary for something else. So part of what we have to do is make these kinds of decisions. And I can tell you the easiest thing to do would just be to say, we're not touching the pews, it's a third rail, we don't want to do it. But I think we're going to do this in a way that honors the history and that allows us to move toward flexibility. The final piece that has to play into how we make decisions, how we prioritize, is a weighted response. And I just want to be really transparent about this. There are a group of lead givers that are very excited about finally fixing the organ. Those lead givers have given together enough of a primary gift to do most of the work on the organ. That means that other people that are not as excited about the organ can know that their giving does not affect the organ. You can give to the flooring. You can give to the lighting. You can give to all sorts of other projects. But because we have a group of folks that are very excited about the organ, and because over the course of several iterations, I think this congregation has really focused in on not a major multi-million-dollar upgrade that does not fit our congregation, and not a super cheap Band-Aid that'll mean that the next vestry has to deal with the organ again. But that we've found a way to do the organ that mixes the best of modern technology with restoring the best of our pipework, and comes in at a really good price. And so sometimes when we've got a group of lead donors that are really excited about a project, it will mean that that project moves up. There are certain projects that are out in Susan's got a list of sort of green, yellow, red, right? And if a certain donor got really excited about one of those projects in the yellow and said, I'm going to up my donation to make that happen, the vestry would have to listen to that. That's part of the way capital campaigns work. But I want to be really transparent about that. That's part of how this is going on. So, I want to show you, and this is a very rough rendering. You'll see a much prettier version of it. This is Mike with Photoshop, not the artist we're hiring. But an early interpretation of what the sanctuary could look like. And you may need to get closer. On the left, you see the sanctuary as it is now. On the right, you see a rough interpretation of what it could look like. And you can't see that big of a difference right now. Some of that is the lighting. We'll put this up on the website as well. But let me talk you through a couple things. What do you notice on the right-hand side? We'll start with what you notice. There are chairs behind some of the historic pews in the back. Like we already have a couple of rows of chairs, there will just be more for flexible seating. Those chairs are both liturgically nice. They're not simple folding chairs. They're comfortable to sit in. They have racks for hymnals and for books of common prayer. Those chairs actually store more than our current pew racks store. They're also stackable, believe it or not. Those chairs can be stacked 5 high and stored away if we wanted to use the sanctuary for, a labyrinth walk or something like that. What else do you notice?
The McDonald's arch is gone.
The color of the arch has changed. That was something that pulled really high. We still, and Brooke, my predecessor, had, I think, a really valid point. A contrast there helps you see the architecture of the building, but the yellow has not proved popular over time. So you'll see you still have a contrast there, but it's a more traditional color for an arch in a church. There are several St. Louis arches that are painted that way inside of churches. What else do you notice? You see that molding along the side? That's actually not crown molding. That is what they're calling a soffit. And the soffit is going to allow us to do a few different things. One, it's going to allow us, instead of, you notice something that's missing up near where that crown molding is up near the front? Those 2 big ugly vents that are behind the preacher and behind the lector, those are gone. Because that molding, that soffit, will allow us to take the air conditioning and send it all the way along the church. So that in the summer, you don't just have a pool of cold air up front, you get cold air all the way along the length of the congregation. The soffit also allows, it's sort of hard to tell, but it will allow us to uplight the vault. So you'll get a nice lighting effect coming up from the soffit. That's pretty cheap to do. It's just putting some lights in that go up. It will also allow us to run a wire all the way around the church, which will allow someone who has a hearing aid to simply flip their hearing aid switch, and then the sound system in the church will deliver right to their hearing aid. It's called a closed loop system. So that soffit design does a few things. It helps highlight the dome. I think it gives us another nice architectural line, but it has all these functional benefits. And I don't think it's ugly. I think it helps with what right now you just have this weird little speaker wire thing up there. I think it makes a nice architectural transition. The other thing you probably can't see as well, we're proposing taking out the carpet and doing a slate-like floor. It won't be actual slate because actual slate breaks, but it'll be a slate-like material that has some rubbery. I've seen it. It's a little spongier than actual stone. It's not really spongy, but it's a little spongier than actual stone, so that if you drop something on it, the stone doesn't break and the pew doesn't break, hopefully. But it'll be a nice hard surface, which will help with the organ sound.
Where's the chapel?
Whereas the chapel stays exactly the same. No change, except probably taking out the carpet and putting in slate in there too. The other thing that's proposed in the chapel is to update windows, and we're still in discussions about what that looks like. Part of it is those chapel windows are our only single pane in there, and it makes it really loud. You hear Delmar. So we're talking about insulating it and putting in an additional layer of window. But to do that, we're going to have to reconfigure those chapel windows. So the vestry is still doing cost options about updating some of the stained glass. And Susan will talk about that. But the chapel will otherwise remain exactly the same, except new floor and potentially better insulation on windows, maybe a new stained glass window or two. Anything else you notice?
There's something to the right of the color, but I can't tell.
Yeah, it's tucked pretty, you're at the back of the church. There's an organ screen in there. You can see pipes. I actually just copied and pasted the organ screen from my old church, St. John's Lafayette Square, and stuck it in there. So it probably won't look exactly like that, but part of the proposal on the organ is to be able to see the organ pipe. There's also on the other side, it's very subtle, and it will hopefully be very subtle when it's done, but there's a new angle to the wall behind the organ console. Having a wall that is angled behind the organ console and the pipes on a slight angle, they're only talking about like 4 degrees, it will mean that you will be able to hear what's happening behind that chancel arch a lot better, because right now we have what's called a standing echo between 2 flat walls, and instead it'll push the sound out. So there's some work on acoustics that's in this as well. Anything else you notice?
All the lights don't remain the same?
Other what?
The lights.
So not all the lights will remain the same. One of the pieces is to do a total update to all LED. We have a mixture of LED and incandescent right now. It'll help us with power bills, and it'll also mean that we'll be able to get modern lighting. There will be potentially, like last year at Advent, we did that blue lighting up on the back. We're talking about putting some color change LEDs back there so that we could change the color back on that high altar for liturgical seasons. And it won't be a bright effect, but for that Advent thing proved really popular. So to have the flexibility in there, since we're updating with LED, it's only a little bit more to do color change LEDs, so why not? Sandra?
Behind the arch, those 3 stained glass windows,
Yep.
are you doing something with the roof line so you can see?
We're hoping to. If you look really close,
I can't tell.
there's hope that we'll be able to, and it may be a sort of like stage effect. It may involve some paint or some stone, but what's the name of that? You always have Trump oil. It may be sort of a Trump oil effect, but we're looking at trying to fix the point in the middle stained glass window. We're still not exactly sure how we're going to do it, but that's in that picture.
I'm really excited about removing the carpeting, but one question is, did the architect advise about how that might affect the acoustics?
So there's an acoustician that's involved in it. One of the things, and I didn't know how to render it, and we're going to let the artist do it, but is a total update of the sound system. And that sound system, they have this thing called a dispersed array. So it'll look like one speaker up front, but it'll actually have all these different directional speakers, and it will help deliver sound better across the length of the nave. So we're playing with fire a little bit in terms of if you make the room a little more wet, like we just did in here, the spoken voice, you can lose a little bit of it. The architect and the acoustician don't think we're in very much danger though, because we're not changing it too much. They think that we're going to get a really nice blend of the organ sound and the choir sound will be a lot better. And frankly, the room is just not large enough to create the kind of delay you have like at Christ Church Cathedral, where my sermons have to slow down by a good 30%. So we're working with acousticians on it, but we're aware of it.
Thank you.
Other question? There may be, and you won't see this in this picture, but there may be some deadening panels built into the back wall that will help do some sound absorption to keep that delay from developing. So you'll get really good sound up to the back wall, but then it won't bounce back at you quite as much. Jean?
I have a question about the heating. Are we going to talk about that at all?
We are going to talk about heating. We'll talk a little bit about it with Brian and how we're financing it. If you go in there, we were able to get the nave up to 67 degrees with some space heaters today. So that Jerome and Cheyenne and I were hustling around putting in space heaters this week. We are getting a new boiler. There's a boiler that's going to be installed next week and the week after. And we had to. Our boiler was, we were told we thought we were going to get 2 more years out of it, and it was DED dead. I can show you pictures on my phone if you want, but there was a big rusted out hole right through the middle of several sections of it. So we had to get a new boiler now.
You mean that's not good?
Yeah, it turns out they won't let me turn it on, Ernie. So we are getting a new boiler. It will be installed in the next couple weeks.
But that's not my question.
Yeah.
So my question is that in this church, everybody sits on the right side.
Oh yeah.
And somebody told me a long time ago because that's where the heat comes in on that side. So that's my question.
Oh, so that's a good question for a couple reasons. One, I would dispute that because I think people come in on the right side because that's where the door that most people come in is. That's what I watch. Are others, do you sit on the right side because it's warmer over there? No. Okay.
Because I've said it for 30 years.
Yeah. So there's that. The other thing is, unfortunately, because the boiler died when it did, we have not been able to do what we really wanted to do, which was to do a full engineering scope to really plan. Now we did discover the thing that we really, really wanted to do was convert to water boilers instead of steam boilers. But we figured out that that was a pipe dream, literally. Because the kind of piping that we have is run through concrete and stone walls and is wrapped in asbestos.
Oh.
And if we dug it out of the concrete and stone walls, we'd have to mitigate for the asbestos. It was not a cost-smart thing to do to try to convert to a water system. It would have been more green and eco-friendly, but it wasn't the cost-smart thing to do. Now, we have not been able to go as, we could have been slightly greener with the steam boiler that we are getting. But we had an emergency situation. And so we got a boiler that could be updated later with a different burner system, but we would have had to wait till mid-January to get that burner system, and we decided we couldn't do that. So we are in a non-ideal situation. We didn't get to do an engineering study and plan the perfect boiler. We will get to do that with the air conditioning system, and they're very separate systems here. But we did find ourselves in a situation that was just an emergency, and it was sort of, we had to do something about it, or we could have pretended we were in England all winter and had a really cold, and we could have broken some pipes, which would have been not fun.
Is that boiler for the whole building, or you get 2 or 3 little?
So the boiler used to be for the whole building, but when this side of the building was updated, well, it wasn't the whole building. The lounge has always had its own system. But this building and the offices used to be on that boiler system, and now they're not. So we actually were able to get a slightly smaller boiler, and we should have a slightly smaller, we got a way more eco-friendly boiler than the old one we had. It's just not as eco-friendly as it could have been. So, but it is a boiler system, and it's really just, we are in 2 buildings. This building is 1938, that building is 1950, and it's the 1950 building that's heated with a boiler. Other questions about that? Susan will be able to say more. And speaking of Susan being able to say more, I'm going to ask Susan to say more. It's amazing.
Okay, so as soon as I know that's all you're looking at. What I wanted to say is between the responses from the feasibility study, the conversations, the things that are clear to me is things around our diversity are very important. So making the building more handicap accessible, you'd be surprised. how well handicap accessible bathrooms poll. People care about that. That polled really highly. Trying to get some better sort of drop-off lane for handicap accessibility. So things like that polled really high. The other things that polled really high, as Mike was just talking about, energy efficiency. So things around making us greener, making us more efficient. So the must-haves, the necessaries are things like we've already been talking about, our HVAC systems, our electrical. A lot of what was interesting in working with the architects was, although our panels on the electrical system are really outdated and really old, if we change, we're gonna have to change them, but we're not gonna have to do as big of upgrades as I thought, because by going to LED lights and more energy efficient other things, we'll actually be reducing our energy load. So those are kind of those things that go together. Otherwise, we've got to get a whole lot more electricity in. For people who don't pay attention between the church and the house next door, it's kind of a dead man's zone. And if you want to see how we're not good neighbors, go look there. We have a retaining wall. It's on our side of the property. It's literally falling down. And it's bad. So those are the sorts of things we have to do so that we don't end up in the neighbor's yard. Thermal windows. Mike talked about the chapel. Those are single pane windows. We need to think about how we do that to get a more energy efficient. We already talked about the lighting, bathrooms, drop-offs, sound system. Another great thing Mike talked about. Things like the kitchen hood. We could leave that hood, but do we really want to leave the hood when it's a big fire hazard, the amount of grease we make down there making breakfast, if we renovate the whole place, and then it burns down. So let's put in a fire suppressing hood, because the number one place fires happen is in a kitchen, especially with a lot of grease. Design. Pews. Mike talked about that. A movable altar. The chapel stained glass. I would also kind of put the plaza up in the desired. At the moment, those are things the building committee met for over 3 hours, maybe 4 hours, I don't know, it was a long night.
Yeah.
With the architect. We went through line item by line item, and line item by line item, and breaking line items down, and debated, and voted, and debated, and voted.
And I got outvoted on skylights.
So some of it is scaling down projects. So we may do some renovations in the kitchen, but we may not change the entire kitchen. It's scaling things down. So these are the things that we talked to the architect about. We talked about putting in maybe
I'm having trouble remembering. Can you just refresh my memory about the plaza, tower, bells and office, what that is?
Yep. So the plaza, and I would put this more in the yellow, is out here. How we turn this into not just a lovely grass area, but how do we turn it into a more usable space for both the neighborhood and us? How do we make it more child-friendly so that we're not afraid to let the kids play out there, that there's some sort of barrier, like maybe a hedgerow or something that kind of keeps kids contained. It's not that expensive of a project, but in the grand scheme, it's somewhere in the middle. It's not a must-have. So we'll see. The tower bells is in the top of the church. There's a tower over here.
Yeah. So there's a proposal to put a bell. We're one of the congregations that doesn't have a bell. And frankly, given the way the adult forum works, I think we could use one. Because it'd be nice to be able to make the bell ring and remind people the church is starting over there. And it was one of the proposals that we put forward to the architect. He's got a way to do it that would actually happen over the lounge, because part of the reason the tower never got built was we had this beautiful set of bells in our old church that we couldn't quite fit in our current tower. So it would be different than, but it was not a high enough priority, so it's on hold.
And there was also, there's the old rector's office up on the 3rd floor. There was talk of renovating that space and turning it into an office space. That's also just been put on hold for now.
So nothing is going to be done to the 3rd floor?
Not up on the 3rd floor. I mean, other than things that you have to do to touch the HVAC, things like that, but we won't be renovating the 3rd floor. We're also at this point, the plan, what I call Brian's Undercroft plan, that is on hold. That is, and I want to say it's on hold. I think the vestry's got some energy about looking into that project. We are receiving a lot more rent for space than I think we even thought we could get at Holy Communion, and there's more appetite. But it's been hard to figure out how to do a study about doing that in a way that's responsible. So we may put that down the road. We may spend the next few years studying what kind of revenue we might be able to receive from it, and rather than doing a big capital campaign for that, find a lead donor and then take on some debt eventually that we would repay by the rent that we'd be getting for that renovated space. But for now, that's just on hold. It was not near a high enough priority, and it doesn't make sense to do that at this moment. Brian, now that I've said about your undercroft space, let's talk about financing.
The next question is, what next? What are we looking forward to? Mike's mentioned a couple times, we're probably going to kick off the capital campaign early in 2019. And with that, we'll be asking for formal pledges for the capital campaign. Before we get to that point, though, before people make their pledges and start needing to start contributing towards their pledge, we've got some costs that we have to provide up front. And the first one that Mike's referenced, is the boiler. And we hadn't planned in our budget or at all for a boiler repair the timeline we needed to. So one of the first things we need to do is to find the cash to pay for the boiler that's going to be going in the near future. Our congregation is very fortunate in that we have an endowment that we've designated specifically for capital campaigns. Typically, we just use the growth of that every year to fund a project like the flooring here or the nursery. But because we need a lot of money very quickly, we're going to do a slightly unconventional activity for Holy Communion. We're going to borrow the full amount, or most of the amount, from that endowment to pay for the boiler that we need today. And so that's going forward right now. The next thing that's going to happen, right about the same time we're probably kicking off the pledging process for capital campaign, is some of these contractors that we're lining up to do work are going to want to be paid money. Strange, I know, but they're going to want to have money in their hands to say that we're serious and that they can start buying materials before we all start collectively writing checks. And so we need to do a little bit of financial movement in advance of that. And what we will likely do is go to the diocese and say we'd like to refinance our White Fund loan, which is the loan that the diocese gives for these type of projects. Now you'll notice the green line at the top, we still are carrying a balance on our White Fund loan now for all of the work that we've done in the prior capital campaigns. We've been paying it down right on schedule, very manageable, and everything is going perfectly. To do this next round of work, we're going to refinance that and bump it back up to probably some portion of the complete cost of the project, just so we can go back to the contractors and say, here's the initial payments for our projects, for the materials, etc., as we get started in early 2019. Now, over the course of 2019, after we've all submitted our pledges and so forth, we'll start collectively writing checks and contributing towards that. And so what we would expect to happen is after we make our initial payment and our cash on hand has dropped again, we'll start building it back up as we all make good on our pledges towards the effort. And so hopefully by the end of the project, and I deliberately didn't put a timeline on the x-axis here because I don't know what it's going to be, by the end of the project, we should have all contributed and met our pledging, and we will repay and refinance that White Fund loan again to bring it down from the full ask that we had to get the ball rolling, back down to hopefully something more like what we've got now, that we would continue paying on for a short time. The other thing we need to do is to pay ourselves back from our endowment. We're doing a short-term loan to get the boiler fixed. Once we have cash in our hand from the loan and from all of our contributions, that'll go back into the endowment, and we'd really like to see that endowment grow, if at all possible, so that we can have more ongoing support year to year for capital projects. So it's going to be a lot of moving around and refinancing a couple different ways. The diocese offers us good options for that, and I think this will work out well to meet all our needs. Denise?
How much does the boiler cost?
The boiler is at 83?
It's 73,000.
73,000.
73,000.
Right, yeah. And that's, we did not get the nicest boiler. We got a good boiler, but we did not get the, Cadillac.
You don't get a discount because of church?
That's with the discount, Martha.
No tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, no
Discount
tax.
and no tax.
And like, does that include labor and?
So that's the boiler, that's the installation, that's the asbestos mitigation, that's all of it. Bob?
So when we borrow from the endowment, is that something like individually borrowing from my 401k and then paying it back?
Yeah, except without any tax implications, because we don't have tax implications of the church. So the idea, and you'll see with Brian's chart, one of the targets for the capital campaign is to reduce debt. It's going to be a moving picture depending on what the actual receipts for the campaign are, but is to reduce our overall debt and to increase the value of the CASKI fund, the endowment for capital projects. In an ideal world, I'd love to see us totally pay off all of our debt and really increase the value of that CASKI fund because it gives us options. The bishop has been he quoted in his speech yesterday at Diocesan Convention, a priest friend of mine in Minnesota, who said, most Episcopal congregations are one busted boiler away from closing. And we are thankfully not in that place. We are a congregation that has had historic vestries that have done incredible work and generosity of generations that has meant that when we faced a busted boiler, the vestry had a designated fund that we could give ourselves a loan out of while we were preparing to do the capital campaign right now. We're thankful not to be in the busted boiler means we close the doors scenario. But we want to be responsible not just for now, but to the next generations of Holy Communionites. So we want to see that CASKI go up over time. The other thing in this is that white fund, that is about as close to free money as you get. The interest rates the diocese gives on the white fund loan are ridiculously low. So there is a reason to carry that kind of debt. It's like if you can get a really good mortgage rate. You don't pay it all off immediately because you've got, it's good and healthy debt. At the same time, I'd like to reduce the debt burden that we even carry now. So we're working on that as a vestry. Jean?
I wanted to ask, and I know that the white loans are not automatic.
Yep.
I want to know how confident we are that that's going to be.
We're pretty confident. We've run, our process so far has all been guided by the guidelines of the diocese around the architecture committee and the white fund loan process. So the question is, the white fund loans are not automatic. We don't just say, hey, we want $500,000. Hand it to me, Bishop. It doesn't happen that automatically. And what I will say is, the bishop and everybody I've talked to and the canon of the ordinary, it's really just a question of going through the steps in the right order. But there's not a question that we'll be able to get. The maximum amount is $500,000. We may have to get a commercial loan depending on how the capital campaign contributions come in. It's helpful if some of those large campaign contributions come in first all at once, or a big portion of them come in early, so we have cash on hand. If that's not possible, we may have to get the white fund loan and a commercial loan. We will pay off the commercial loan before we pay off the white fund loan because we're going to go with the higher interest rate gets paid off first. But that's the kind of situation we're in.
Mike, you bring up an interesting question about the timing, and one of the things we've talked about that may be interesting to people that have not yet pledged is that if there's a reason you would want to give in 2018 for a tax reason,
Yeah.
We're not going to turn it away. That's actually that a lot. So if you have a personal reason that you think it would be much better to write a check in the 2018,
Or make a contribution of stock.
yeah, that too. That's even better because then you don't have to pay the taxes on it and give smaller amounts later. Stock's actually a fantastic way of doing it. Please consider it, and we're happy to talk about that.
Lori?
Post these, I'm having trouble keeping.
Yeah, so we're video recording this and the slides will be online along with the audio.
Okay, I need a breakdown, just the estimates of some of the major things.
Oh, so that's already available in the feasibility study and the materials that came out. It's in emails past. Other questions? It's a lot of information. Sandra?
About the kitchen.
Yeah.
You said we would be doing some things, but not everything. Will we be doing enough to make it pass inspection for outside food?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope so, because that's something I feel strongly about. It's one of the things that we've talked to the architect about. And at the moment, he's taken our new revised wish list, where we rated everything on a 1 to 5 scale of, I think 1 was must do and 5 was
Was
put
it
on hold.
mainly the oven? The stove, that mainly the reason why?
There's a few pieces. It's the oven and the hood. The hood principally, that's the most expensive. We have to have a separate hand washing sink now that we don't have. You have to have a separate hand washing station. There's a few renovational changes.
And some are code-based changes, probably things that wouldn't keep us from getting certified. We've got stainless steel counters. We don't need to change those, so we probably won't.
We may need to re-weld parts of them. This is where we are. It's hard to say exactly in some of the projects what will come because we're still in the what's happening with the architect's place. It's like the drop-off. We have a real, and it's something we're putting in we want to get this financed to change our current sidewalk weirdness about 3 parking spots for handicap on the sidewalk in front of the church into a drop-off lane out there is something we want to do. But can we get through the U-City politics to do that? I don't know. It's really going to depend on what the mayor's administration thinks. So that's the kind of stuff, it's very hard to say yes or no, but it's something that's a high enough priority, we're going to push on it to try to make it happen. And I'd say commercial certification is a really high priority, and we're at the whim of U-City inspectors, which any of you who live in U-City know, it's a dangerous place to be. So we're working on it.
So if that becomes a drop-off lane out there, where is going to be disabled parking?
So that's something, it would still be available as 3 spaces. It would be paved instead of concrete, but there's doing that would mean that if a future vestry decided that we wanted to move to like a valet situation for folks who are disabled, because right now we're limited, we only have 3 spots. If you have a 4th person, where do they park?
Right.
So it would allow the vestry to make the decision, okay, this is now a drop-off, and there'll be a valet there, and if you're disabled, the valet is here to hand the keys to. That's the kind of thing that it would allow us. It would also mean that a disabled person doesn't have to go up on the curb to get up there. It's a flexibility question. So I can't promise you how we'll designate it, but the idea is to change it so that it's more useful. Other questions, thoughts? So we're going to be moving into what is known as a quiet phase now with the campaign. You're not going to hear a lot about the Capital Campaign until we get really to the annual meeting at the very beginning of February, probably. Because we're going to be working with some of the folks who have identified themselves as potential larger donors, and we're going to be working with the architects and the engineers on what exactly it is that we're going to be able to do for this. And those numbers change depending on estimates they get and what the mood of the U-City inspectors are. So we've got to go into what's known as a quiet phase for a little while. So just because it's going quiet for a bit, don't hear that nothing's happening. The vestry's going to have to do some work behind the scenes for a little bit so that we're ready for a public launch in early 2019. Thank you all so very much. for taking the time with this. We'll stick around. I can stick around for about 4 minutes. Your wardens and treasurer can stick around a little bit longer than that. We won't have adult formation next Sunday because it's Thanksgiving weekend and we're giving the breakfast cooks and everybody the Sunday off. On December 2nd, adult formation and godly pay will return. Our speaker on December 2nd is my good friend, Dr. Adam Ploy, professor of history at Eden Seminary. He was really popular last year. He's a really great teacher. He's going to be talking about the history of and the theology of nativity scenes. We have a new nativity set that we're going to debut that day that comes, it's carved out of olive wood from Bethlehem, and we bought it in Bethlehem this summer. So we'll get to see that. But he's going to talk about all of these pieces of the nativity scenes, many of which don't come out of the Bible. But he's going to talk about their history and their theology and what we mean when we talk about the nativity. So you won't want to miss that. That's on December 2nd. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the wardens and to Brian. And we'll see you December 2nd for the adult forum.